Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Hauser Wirth. I'm Zoe Sperling, Senior Director based in London, who has the great privilege to work very closely with Allison. We're thrilled to welcome you all here this evening for this very special conversation with artist Allison Katz and art historian Suzanne Hudson, celebrating tonight's opening of Allison Katz's Westward Ho. This marks Allison's first solo exhibition, both in LA and with the gallery. In Westward Ho, Katz creates a cosmos by overlapping seemingly disparate images and narratives from art history, visual culture, her lived experience, and the coincidence that interconnect around her. The title firmly locates us with a tongue-in-cheek undertone inside the gallery in West Hollywood, WeHo, and debuts all new paintings, some of which were completed during her recent residency at Hauser Wirth, Somerset, alongside site-specific responses to the architecture of the gallery's 1930s Spanish colonial revival building. Allison is also currently working on an exhibition at the Aspen Art Museum, which will open next summer, and we're very happy to have those colleagues with us here this evening. Suzanne Hudson is a professor of art history and fine arts at the University of Southern California in Los Angeles, where she was also recently named faculty fellow in the Society of Fellows. Hudson is an art historian and critic whose research spans the 19th through the 21st centuries, with special emphasis on the history, theory, and conventions of painting within art schools and alternative pedagogical institutions, which include spaces of care work and medical and psychological services. She is the author of a number of books, including Robert Ryman, Use Paint, Agnes Martin, Night Sea, and Contemporary Painting in the World of Art series, and is the co-editor of Contemporary Art, 1989 to present. There'll be a fantastic opportunity at the end to ask any questions, so please don't be shy and feel welcome. Thank you again for being with us this evening, and with that, I hand you over to Allison and Suzanne.
This show is at least a year in the making, and Allison had the opportunity to come here and see this space last year and then be in residence at Somerset in the intervening period. So some of this work, including this piece, which hopefully you'll talk about in just a moment, very much relates to where we are and how we understand ourselves in relation to place and technologies of vision and how we move through the city as well as galleries. But we thought this might be a nice place to start and also to talk a little bit more about the genesis of what you're seeing and how it got to be here and how it relates to where we are together tonight.
Hi. When I visited the space for the first time, which was also my first time in Los Angeles proper last year, and I stood outside the gallery, I looked at the front door and then I looked above it and I saw this. So this is outside, above the front door, just in case you haven't seen it.
We were having this conversation about what a pedestrian and horizontal city, in some ways it both is and isn't, and how we don't always look up at the architecture above street level in the same way that we might in other urban environments. But anyway, I was curious. I have to admit that I had not noticed it, so I will come clean on that.
But to me, it was instantly a painting that I knew I was going to have to remake or make it into a painting, because it had all the elements to me of how a painting can almost function now, but carry with it traces of motifs from the past. And I instantly thought, this is so absurd and what a folly, because it's totally dysfunctional. But then I also saw Goya's Maya's at the balcony, and then Manet's painting, and Magritte, and this idea of the balcony being a platform projecting out of a building, somewhere where you can see, but you can also be seen. This threshold, kind of perfect space to contemplate vision and to stage and perform almost like an iconography of image. But then the fact that it was blocked and blank made it seem that it was also speaking to the limits of figuration to me, and how could I continue on from that motif when, in fact, the blank is a way to continue, because it becomes the screen upon which we can project anything or nothing. And the block, which is at once part of painting's problem, but it's also its permission. And the simple act of the decorative swirl, which reminded me of France, and I thought about the immigration to Los Angeles from Europe, pre and post-war, and how maybe the nostalgia for the Mediterranean could have influenced this Spanish revival, or whatever it's called. I'm not an architectural student, but this idea of context and seeing this here would mean something very different if you did see it in Europe. And moving through those different places, but always having something that is both local and historical in something very simple.
And I think we're going to come back to this kind of question of the limits of painting as a material
to work with.
Yeah, but also as a kind of conceptual, ideological convention, technology, maybe with some of the others. But before we kind of move, I do want to kind of, suggest already the kind of presence of portals and blocked vistas simultaneously, and how so many of the paintings contain framing devices within them, which hopefully we'll kind of get to a few more around the corner.
Yeah.
But before we move on, I have my cheat sheet here for all the titles, because it's not just the title of Westward Ho, but I think the titles of all of the individual paintings are also so significant, and how you also incorporate your own initials and wordplay within some of the compositions themselves. So I didn't know before we left kind of Hollywood behind, or if you wanted to say a little bit of something about language and its properties potentially as material concept, but also something found in the way that you're describing kind of other source images and things lurking behind even the monochrome here.
Yeah. Well, I could say that I thought when I came last year too, it was funny how everyone was calling this neighborhood WeHo, and I thought that was a very cute slang, but it also made me think of this place that I had visited in 2016 in England, which is a beach town called Westward Ho. And it's named after a novel, and that's named after a play, and that's named after the hollering of the boatmen along the Thames. So this Westward Ho has been used since Elizabethan times for various titles of different cultural production, but it seemed to me that actually it was embedded already in West Hollywood and in WeHo, and the ho, this hollering out, which was almost like a call. And I do see painting as a kind of call and response and a conversation. So it seemed to me that it was sort of obvious, even though yeah, it's also like a direction. Obviously, I was thinking about coming here the second I left. And this idea of always something being slightly out of reach, like when you're driving, but I don't drive, so when I'm passengering, and you see the horizon that kind of keeps eluding you, and that's really, to me, a good way of describing how a painting gets made and unmade, because you have an idea, or you have a word, or you have a kind of prompt or a glimpse. You have the drive, but then you have all this chasing and the shifts that have to happen. And so an idea in relation to painting is relational. It's not an absolute, and it changes as you make the thing over time.
And I think for people who didn't have the opportunity to see the painting on the other side of this wall, I think that's a beautiful kind of metaphoric, but also very literal instantiation of that. And it's occurring to me while you're talking how interesting it is that they're on the two sides of the same wall, with the one that seems like it's kind of opening into some pictorial, illusionistic space, and then the other really, cutting that off. So subverting the pleasure.
Yeah. And yeah, it's important to me in a way with that, painting's force is the ability to make 3 dimensions on a single plane. And it's always about breaking the wall illusionism is metaphorical and visual. But something sculpture always had was the round, that you could walk around something. So part of my interest in restaging and in placing paintings on, constructed freestanding walls is to get that sense of movement and that sense of almost the back of something, even the back of a thought or the other side of something, that should unconsciously kind of sink in when looking, that there's always something unseen that goes into the image too.
And I guess in this, it's almost like the infinite regress of all the other images lurking behind the one image.
Yeah.
But the way that I think it becomes a kind of choose your own adventure through it, and there are different kind of relationships that get instantiated depending on how you what you see first, and it's not wholly directed what that sequence will be.
Exactly. And just to add to that thing you were saying about all the paintings, in my mind when I was painting this, that the myth of the blank canvas, I think, is still really strong, but nothing is ever truly blank. Yeah. But it's a trick I play on myself all the time as a painter, and yet it's one of those very fruitful images to see nothing.
Well, maybe this is a nice moment for us to transition. We were thinking we would head where you see it looks like a kind of skylight.
Yeah.
This seemed like a really interesting place to come. This, to me, was such an interesting kind of pairing, and I like them being on this axis. And in relation to where we look, as well as to this question of a portal or an opening or a framing device within the picture that's kind of redoubling the surface and the edges and the armature and the kind of material, as well as, again, kind of conventions of painting historically, but with the building to look up and here to look up as well, and maybe to pay attention anew to the skylight, which is really uncannily close, I guess, at this hour to this blue, but which actually has an origin that's not so site-specific to this architecture as the other one did. So I was hoping you could maybe talk a little bit about this as a found image, but also what compelled you to motivate it at this particular juncture.
Yeah, so I've found this image over 20 years ago in one of my father's magazines, because he's a carpenter, and it was Fine Home Building. It was like his Vogue that he reads every month. And when I saw this image all those years ago, I was just amazed at how it seemed to me like a treatise on painting. It explained all the metaphysical components of orientation and framing and construction and the gaze, eternity, infinity, and then also, let's say, the ground. And the way that it was skewed and torqued, it had a wall, but it was underneath. It really played on my mind forever. I made a poster with it in 2012, but I never felt like I needed to paint it. And then I went to Pompeii, I went to Rome, and I walked in all these ancient houses that had these atriums. And below the atrium, they would have a pool of water. And again, I was struck by the presence of these metaphysical terms of painting, which was eternity and reflection. As above, so below. And it sort of clicked, and I had also been in Venice, where I had been looking up at all these incredible ceilings and thought like how rare it is now to accept an experience of painting where you're craned, even making it on your back, like all these contortions that used to be so much a part of painting. Now it's so restricted to one way of looking. So I thought it was an amazing opportunity to try to bring in other forms of placement of both the viewer and the maker. And then I came to visit this space, and I was like, are you kidding? Well, that's great. Because here, again, the skylight and like the James Turrell and the history of light and space in California and the blue sky, which is actually, I believe, like a material here. Living in London, where you see a sky like this once a month, you'd be like blown away. So yeah, and the color blue being something both opaque and transparent, very ungraspable thing to paint, took so many layers, and I kept thinking, I just kept losing it because I don't see it often. But yeah, that's kind of also a little bit of a way that I hold on to images for a long time. But to push it over into the act of making a painting, which can take a long time and which you have to kind of renegotiate frequently, has to be something external, like a big set of coincidences or signs or an invitation, or someone says something and then all of a sudden you remember that thing in the drawer. So I think time plays a big role in like nerve.
I think that's such a beautiful transition to the time of the pond that is on the other side of these walls, and then maybe look at what you're seeing on this side, and then we'll talk about the kind of double images on the other side. Will you share what everyone's looking at in terms of the triptych and how it relates to some of the ideas of time maybe, and also light sources within the painting, which we haven't really talked about, but there's a work in the very front that you'll see again when we're all done if you haven't already kind of looked at it. But one of the first paintings that's to your left when you enter this space is actually a work of your apartment, and it's called Contre-jour, and it has a very particular light effect, which maybe you can talk a little bit about. But thinking about the way that light is functioning in so many of these works and what it means to try to paint something so evanescent and so much in flux and ambient, but to give it materiality. And I think that's something that connects a number of these works, but maybe it's a good place to kind of talk about that.
Yeah, the pond painting, which is the 3 on the back, is titled Responding. Outside, I spent 6 months at this residency in Somerset, and outside the studio was a pond that I got a little made fun of by my husband for staring at every day for hours and becoming like a 6-year-old boy. But the activity in the pond was, to me, like the most incredible abstract painting, because every day, especially once spring started, I watched thousands of tadpoles be born, grow legs, and walk out of the water. And it was freaky, and it was also incredible, and it was a lot of what I was already thinking about with walking and forms and framing. You know, you had all this primordial activity framed inside this little pond. But it got me thinking, too, about the reflection and this underside, and how formlessness is also really important, that the frame of painting is very rational, but this you know, that it should be in service of the irrational in some way, or the field of painting is so that you can test your imagination. And in that sense, I also wanted, when one comes around to the back of the exhibition, to sort of have the whole show break apart a bit and be interrupted by this escape, and by a painting almost trying to divide itself and move and get out of itself. And I'm very interested in entrances and exits, and those edges are there to be poked at in some way. So all I could see was the clouds becoming the mud, and everything was inverted. So that was how I felt about what happens when you go around to the other side.
Mm-hmm. And maybe to kind of pick up on that a little bit, the idea of legs and movement, and the you were talking earlier about the idea of sculpture having a different kind of physical relation to us as opposed to paintings often, and the move to architecture as a way to think about how painting might behave to that. But here, I don't know if you want to talk about this at all, and the kind of frozen movement, but also the different surface qualities, and or whichever part of this you want to pick up on, but also in terms of source material. You mentioned that the one, now I'm already like, where were we? Over there. That it was source that your dad had and was something that you'd held on to for a long time and then kind of pulled into service at a particular moment. But this is also a photograph of your grandmother, and there are other forms of, I would hesitate to say maybe self-portraiture, but ideas of authorship that are embedded in these. And so I don't know which part of any of this you might want to kind of bring some of this to a pause through, but I'll leave it to you.
Yeah, okay, thank you. I have 2 photographs of my grandmother, Ruth, looking at art, and it's on the same day, and she's at the Fondation Mecte in the mid-70s in the south of France. And when I thought about looking at a photograph of a sculpture, but that I make paintings, it suddenly occurred to me that that conversation between those 3 modes was content in and of itself, or was the subject. And that's why I sculpted the sculpture. And in different ways, I think the illusionism of painting that is so seductive is actually enhanced when it's broken. So disrupting that surface is a way to think about looking. And I'm really committed to, that testing out those technologies of seeing with our own eyes and what happens, how much we want illusionism, and then in the ways in which we can actually access the meaning of the image if the surface is disrupted. And when I envisioned this painting, I thought I wanted it on a wall that we could walk around it and make a little bit of a poke at what sculpture gets to do that painting doesn't necessarily. And I thought too about this, the Giacometti being like this existential idea of 20th century angst. I mean, and it's very iconic. And all the Giacometti sculptures of men get to walk, and the ones of women are still. And I love my grandmother's mixture of belief and doubt, and that kind of gaze, so returning the gaze with her own movement.
Well, I think that might be a really nice place to kind of pause and open it up for questions if people have them, but on that kind of line of pleasure and doubt and seeing.
Hi, lovely work. I'm very curious, what movies do you enjoy, or cinema? Because I feel like there's a sense of movement and also a sense of mise en scène.
That is a very great question, because I do not watch movies. I like movie posters, but I don't watch any movies. It's, I know it's weird. Sorry, Hollywood.
Hi, I'm wondering why you keep the sides of the canvases raw so we can see kind of the marks that have been made throughout the process.
I think that paintings should be seen as they were made, and especially when they're made now, no frames, no glass, just the thing. And that seems pretty neat. Yeah. I'm not really like a very messy, I'm not throwing the paint around paint, so I figure is what it is.
Cool. Very specific reference to Seurat.
Yeah.
What took you with this particular sort of selected image? And also the way you cropped it, just if you could address that.
I was thinking about what is the most iconic ho, like hollering in the history of painting. And this painting is in London at the National Gallery. It's The Bathers at Asnières by Seurat. And the ground is marble. It's chips of marble. So that was my continuation of these sculptural surfaces deployed so that I could almost do a ready-made impression, a ready-made pointillism. The rocks were doing the breaking apart, but it was also a bit pondy from what I was looking at, all the silt and stuff like that. But yeah, no, that was really the one and only. If anyone knows another one, The Call.
I'm asking the artist to talk about the sort of picture postcard shield, heraldic shield cutout of the Grand Canal in Venice. What drew you to that, or was that just a visit to the Biennale? I mean, these are like souvenirs. I mean, this is like, we have a Venice in LA, but it's not like that.
Yeah, it is.
And it's like, it is, you think?
No, I mean, I thought about Venice
Beach. Oh, really? Okay. All right, because, okay. All right. Okay. All right, someone else. Oh, there we go.
I've noticed that you do a lot of autobiographical, inspiration, but you also have quite a few like AK graphs where you've included like your name or your initials.
It is a way of thinking about the figure and, self-portraiture by any other means. I'm not so much interested in representation when it comes to myself or other bodies per se, but I'm interested in how language becomes a surrogate, even as an image. So when we sign our names, that can actually stand for us legally. And I thought how odd that is, because if you put your initial somewhere, that doesn't necessarily look like you. But in that case, I'm constructing a face using my name, broken down into the features. It's just playing with these basic principles of the given, the given name, the given signature, what constitutes a body, and how we could find these other ways of inscribing the self, which is anyway multitudes. So it doesn't serve me to just do a self-portrait in a direct way, but I am quite curious at the ways in which one appears in the world. And I think we do appear in these alternate forms, but they're not necessarily so pictorial until they get subsumed into other images.
I'm curious about the painting over here with just like there's so many of you. I'm assuming it's you.
Maybe not.
Well, if you could just talk about that one a little bit. It feels like a fashion advertisement or like a surreal image, and I like it a lot.
The source material is a 1980s advertisement for the tights called Legs. I don't know if anyone remembers those. They were inside an egg, which is the kind of ambient advertising when I was growing up in the 80s. But it occurred to me later that's like a really wild connection to make between like going out on the town and your fertility. Like, it's an egg. But all these, advertising is really clever in these subliminal ways to perform and sell a sexuality or evolutionary desires or beauty standards. But they get into our minds, they become, actually they compose our sense of image making and identity and all these things. So to revisit that, again, it's like very odd to think how much we've absorbed unconsciously. And how much this was also possibly, or not, who knows, referring to like Nude Descending a Staircase or Edward Muybridge photographs, and basically like the banging head frustration of how you show movement in a still image, how it becomes so monstrous so quick, and I loved that monstrosity, but for a long time it didn't have the lettering. But I knew that it was missing something that was more figurative than figurative, so to say. And when I was looking at this Times New Roman font, this sans serif, that the serif was like legs. It had the Giacometti A frame. It had almost bones, and the way that the letter was so bodily. And I called this painting Catwalk because it's a pun on cats and walking, but also a catwalk. A catwalk was originally a term for a gangplank, like a very narrow structure that you had to walk on, almost like a tightrope. And I thought that's basically what painting feels like a lot of the time. You're trying to balance these multiple things within a very narrow space, but also a metaphysical space and a kind of idea space. And the lines are also the thing that you walk, that composes the image.
Thank you so much, Allison and Suzanne. On behalf of all of us, thank you so much, and I hope this is the beginning of a much longer dialogue between the two of you. So thank you. Thanks.